Welcome back to History 101. My name is Christina Paris. I'm your instructor for this course, and this evening we're going to be covering Chapter 18, Life in Industrial America. So let me get my chapter set up here, and let me share the screen with you for our presentation. So if you have the slide packet, we'll be going over the numbered slides so you know exactly where we are. Right. Beginning. There we go. So this is slide number 1, our opening slide, which is the title of the lecture we're going to be covering today. Our table of contents is slide 2. We have section 1 will be on the video clip that we always have, a little short video to keep you awake and aware of what we're doing. The second part of the lecture will obviously be the lecture itself, and the third part, the interactive activity. So here we go. Slide number 3 is the video clip, introduction slide. Slide 4 takes us to the video clip. So it's on the history of Morse code. And maybe you've never heard of Morse code, maybe you have. There's a short little video I have here. I have the link here. If it doesn't physically work, there's the address. So you can type it into your search engine and it will take you to the actual video. The Morse code, in short, just to give you a little nutshell description of what it is it's a series of dashes and dots that would have been long and short that let people know that they were coded in such a way that you would know which was a letter and which was a pause between letters and pause between words. So you'd be able to decipher out. This code was used by telegraph operators and wireless telegraph operators eventually as well. So anyway, it'll talk about the history of Morse code in this video clip. Slide 5 takes us to the introduction to the lecture. And finally, our actual lecture itself, which is section 2 in your lecture. As we always do, we skip over the introduction to the lecture. I do apologize for that, but that is how it works out. So this one is industrialization and technological innovation. So we open up by talking about the railroads, which created the first great concentration of capitals and spawned the first massive corporations, made the first of the vast free fortunes that would define the Gilded Age, unleashed labor demands that united thousands of farmers and immigrants, and linked many towns and cities. So the railroads really accomplished a great deal during the Gilded Age. The National Railroad mileage tripled in the 20 years after the outbreak of the Civil War and tripled again over the next 4 decades that followed, excuse me. Railroads impelled the creation of uniform time zones across the country, gave industrialists access to remote markets, and opened the American West. We're going to be discussing in more detail in a minute all these points. Railroad companies were the nation's largest businesses. Their vast national operations demanded the creation of innovative new corporate organization, advanced management techniques, and vast sums of capital. Their huge expenditures spurred countless industries and attracted droves of laborers. And as they crisscrossed the nation, they created a national market, a truly national economy, and seemingly a national culture. The railroads are really going to transform the country, not just by the physical nature of expanding markets, expanding our economy, but also our culture as well. And we're going to talk about how these points come to be. The railroads were not natural creations. Their vast capital requirements required the use of incorporation, a legal innovation that protected shareholders from losses. Enormous amounts of government support followed. Federal, state, and local governments offered unrivaled handouts to create the national rail networks. Lincoln's Republican Party, which dominated government policy during the Civil War and Reconstruction, passed legislation granting vast subsidies, hundreds of millions of acres of land, and millions of dollars worth of government bonds were freely given to build the great transcontinental railroads and the innumerable trunk lines that quickly annihilated the vast geographic barriers that had so long sheltered American cities from one another. And trunk lines are these shorter railroads that branch off of the transcontinental line and really take you to different areas of the nation. It really finds all the everybody interconnected by doing this with the main railroad. So as we shall find, let's move on here. As railroad construction drove economic development, new means of production spawned new systems of labor. Many wage earners had traditionally seen factory work as a temporary stepping stone to attaining their own small businesses or farms. After the war, however, new technology and greater mechanization meant fewer and fewer workers could legitimately aspire to economic independence. Stronger, more organized labor unions formed to fight off for a growing, more permanent working class. At the same time, the growing scale of economic enterprises increasingly disconnected owners from their employees and day-to-day business operations. So we see that the average man is no longer able to break free after a short period of time, go off on his own, and become an entrepreneur at this point in time in history. Most men are forced to continue working in these low pay, menial jobs, these factory based jobs in a lot of cases. And these jobs are laborious, they are labor intensive. Sometimes they are backbreaking. Oftentimes they are so straining and so taxing that sometimes they're very dangerous. You think of people who work in iron and steel factories. These factories are very dangerous. You're dealing with molten metals, where you fall into where they're smelting these metals, you're dead. You fall into these great machines. Same basic principle. You fall into grinders. You're dead. Uh, this is a brutal life, a brutal, dangerous life. To handle their vast new operations, owners turned to managers. Educated bureaucrats swelled the ranks of an emerging middle class. Industrialization also remade much of American life outside the workplace. Rapidly growing industrialized cities knit together urban consumers and rural producers into a single integrated national market. Food production and consumption, for instance, were utterly nationalized. Chicago's stockyards seemingly tied it all together. Between 1866 and 1886, so 20 years, ranchers drove 1 million head of cattle annually overland from Texas ranches to railroad depots in Kansas for shipment by rail to Chicago. After traveling through modern disassembly lines, the animals left the adjoining slaughterhouses as slabs of meat to be packed into refrigerated rail cars and sent to butcher shops across the continent. By 1885, a handful of large-scale industrial meat packers in Chicago were producing nearly 500 million pounds of dressed beef annually. So these meat packing facilities in Chicago are highly efficient. But there's things going on in these meat packing plants, as we will find, that are not necessarily sanitary. They do not have sanitary conditions, and they do not practice the greatest ways of slaughtering meat. Um, and this is all going to be uncovered. We're going to talk about in future chapter about what is discovered and how it comes to light, what's really happening behind the scenes, so to say. So, the new scale of industrialized meat production transformed the landscape. Buffalo herds, grasslands, and old growth forests gave way to cattle, corn, and wheat. Chicago became the gateway city, a crossroads connecting American agriculture, goods, capital markets in New York and London, and consumers from all corners of the United States. Technological innovations accompanied economic development. Ultimately, as we see, there were all sorts of innovations that were beginning to break through. One of the primary inventors of this time is Thomas Edison. And in September of 1878, Edison announced a new and ambitious line of research and development, which was electric power and lighting. The scientific principles behind dynamos and electric motors, the conversion of mechanical energy to electrical power, and vice versa, were long known, but Edison applied the age's bureaucratic and commercial ethos to the problem. Far from a lone inventor gripped by inspiring toiling in isolation, Edison advanced the model of commercially minded management of research and development. Edison folded in his two identities, business manager and inventor, together. He called his Menlo Park Research Laboratory an invention factory and promised to turn out a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months or so. He brought his fully equipped Menlo Park Research Laboratory and the skilled machinists and scientists he employed to bear on her problem of building an electric power subsystem and commercializing it. And by late fall 1879, Edison exhibited his system of power generation and electrical light for reporters and investors. Then he scaled up production. He sold generators to businesses. By the middle of 1883, Edison had overseen construction of 330 plants powering over 60,000 lamps in factories, offices, printing houses, hotels, and theaters around the world. He convinced municipal officials to build central power stations and run power lines. New York's Pearl Street Central Station opened in September 1882 and powered a square mile of downtown Manhattan. Electricity revolutionized the world. It not only illuminated the night, it powered the second industrial revolution. Factories could operate at anywhere at any hour. Electric rail cars allowed for cities to build out, and electrical elevators allowed for them to build up. So all of a sudden, you see this grand change in things. These factories that used to rely on um, water to power their mills, that had to build their mills along what was known as fall lines to generate the power that they needed to run their factories. Now their factories could be located anywhere. They could run their factories all day and night. They could be because not only did they have to rely on natural light, um, they had the advantage of having electrical light bulbs lighting their shop floors. So this changes everything. Of course, as we realize, these revolutionary changes would not occur without conflict and consequences, but they demonstrated the profound transformations remaking the nation. So it brings us to our next slide, slide 7, immigration and urbanization. So, industry pulled even more Americans into cities. Manufacturing needed the labor pool and infrastructure. America's urban population increased sevenfold in the half century after the Civil War. Soon, the United States had more large cities than any country in the world. The 1920 U.S. Census revealed that for the first time, a majority of Americans lived in urban areas. Much of that urban growth came from the millions of immigrants pouring into the nation. Between 1870 and 1920, over 25 million immigrants arrived in the United States. By the turn of the 20th century, new immigrant groups such as Italians, Poles, and Eastern European Jews made up a larger percentage of arrivals than the Irish and the Germans. The specific reasons that immigrants left their particular countries and the reasons they came to the United States, what historians call push pull factors, varied. Um, This is due to the fact that some were forced out of their country. Some were coming to better their lives. Some were only believed they were coming temporarily. They were going to make their fortune and go back home. Some did, some didn't, as we find. Industrial capitalism was the most important factor that drew immigrants to the United States between 1880 and 1920. Immigrant workers labored in large industrial complexes producing goods such as steel, textiles, and food products, replacing smaller and more local workshops. The influx of immigrants, alongside a larger movement of Americans from the countryside to the city, helped propel the rapid growth of cities like New York, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. By 1890, immigrants and their children accounted for roughly 60% of the population in most larger northern cities, and sometimes as high as 80 and 90%. Many immigrants, especially from Italy and the Balkans, always intended to return home with enough money to purchase land, just as we were talking about. But what about those who stayed? Did the new arrivals assimilate together in American land? Or American melting pot, excuse me, becoming just one of those already in the United States? Or did they retain and sometimes even strengthen their traditional ethnic identities? The answer lies somewhere in between. Immigrants from specific countries and often specific communities often clustered together in ethnic neighborhoods. They formed vibrant organizations and societies, such as Italian workmen's clubs, Eastern European Jewish Mutual Aid Society, and Polish Catholic churches to ease the transition to their new American home. Immigrant communities published newspapers in dozens of languages and purchased spaces to keep their arts, languages, and traditions alive. And for these foundations, they facilitated even more immigration. After staking out a claim to some corner of American life, they wrote home and encouraged others to follow them. Historians call this chain migration. Many cities' politics adapted to immigrant populations. The infamous urban political machines often operated as a kind of mutual aid society. New York City's Democratic Party machine, popularly known as Tammany Hall, drew the greatest ire from critics and seemed to embody all of the worst of city machines. But it also responded to immigrant needs. In 1903, journalist William Reardon published a book, Plunkett of Tammany Hall, which chronicled the activities of ward healer George Washington Plunkett. Plunkett elaborately explained to Reardon the difference between honest graft and dishonest graft. I made my pile in politics, but at the same time, I served the organization and got more big improvements for New York City than any other living man. While exposing corruption, Reardon also revealed the hard work Plunkett undertook on behalf of his largely immigrant constituency. On a typical day, Reardon wrote, Plunkett was awakened at 2 a.m. to bail out a saloon keeper who stayed open too late, was awakened again at 6 a.m. because of a fire in the neighborhood, and spent time finding lodging for families displaced by the fire, and after spending the rest of the morning in court to secure the release of several of his constituents, found jobs for the four unemployed men, attended an Italian funeral, visited a church, social, and dropped in on a Jewish wedding. He returned home at midnight. So Tammany's Hall corruption, especially under the reign of William Boss Tweed, was legendary. But the public works projects that funded Tammany Hall's graft also provided essential infrastructure and public services for the city's rapidly expanding population. Water, sewer, and gas lines, schools, hospitals, civic buildings, and museums, police and fire departments, roads, parks, and notably Central Park, and bridges, notably the Brooklyn Bridge, all could, in whole or in part, be credited to Tammany's reign. Still, machine politics could never be enough. As the urban population exploded, many immigrants found themselves trapped in crowded, crime ridden slums. Americans eventually took notice of this urban crisis and of proposed municipal reforms, but also grew concerned about the declining quality of life in rural areas. While cities boomed, rural worlds languished. Some Americans scoffed at rural backwardness and reveled in the countryside's decay, but many romanticized the countryside, celebrated rural life, and wondered what had been lost in the cities. Sociologist Kenyon Butterfield, concerned by the sprawling nature of industrial cities and suburbs, regretted the eroding social position of rural citizens and farmers. Agriculture does not hold the same relative rank among our industries that it did in former years. Butterfield saw the farm problem as part of the whole question of democratic civilization. He and many others thought that the rise of the cities and the fall of the countryside threatened traditional American values. Many proposed conservation. Liberty Hyde Bailey, a botanist and rural scholar, selected by Theodore Roosevelt to chair a federal commission on country life in 1907, believed that rural places and industrial cities were linked. Every agricultural question in a city is a city question. Many longed for a middle path between the cities and the country. New suburban communities on the outskirts of American cities defined themselves in opposition to urban crowding. Americans contemplated the complicated relationship between rural places, suburban living, and urban spaces. Los Angeles became a model for the suburban development of rural places. Dana Bartlett, a social reformer in Los Angeles, noted that the city, stretching across dozens of small towns, was a better city because of its residential identity as a city of homes. This language was seized upon by many suburbs that hoped to avoid both urban sprawl and rural decay. In Glendora, one of these small towns on the outskirts of Los Angeles, local leaders were loath as anyone to see it become cosmopolitan. Instead, in order to have Glendora grow along the lines necessary to have it remain an enjoyable city of homes, they needed to bestir ourselves to direct its growth by encouraging not industry or agriculture, but residential development. So now we come to the New South and the problem of race. So there was a South of Slavery and Secession. Atlanta Constitution editor Henry Grady proclaimed in an 1886 speech in New York, "That South is dead." Grady captured the sentiment of many white Southern business and political leaders who imagined a new South that could turn its back to its past and by embracing industrialization and diversified agriculture. He promoted the region's economic possibilities and mutual future prosperity through an alliance of Northern capital and Southern labor. Grady and other New South boosters hoped to shape the region's economy in the North's image. They wanted industry and they wanted infrastructure, but the past could not be escaped. Economic and socially, the New South would still be much like the old. So as we start looking at this, a New South seemed an obvious need. The Confederacy's failed insurrection wreaked havoc on the Southern economy and crippled Southern prestige. If we remember correctly, from the beginning of this course in Reconstruction, obviously, the Civil War had destroyed not everything about the South, down to the morale of the people. This is where we also get the lost cause narrative coming into play. Is the South trying to recover from this devastating crush that they fall into? Property was destroyed, lives were lost, political power vanished, and 4 million enslaved Americans, representing the wealth and power of the antebellum white South, threw off their chains and walked proudly forward into freedom. Emancipation unsettled the Southern social order When Reconstruction regimes attempted to grant freed people full citizenship rights, anxious whites struck back. From their fear, anger, and resentment, they lashed out, not only in organized terrorist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, but in political corruption, economic exploitation, and violent intimidation. White Southerners took back control of state and local governments and used their reclaimed power to disenfranchise African Americans and pass Jim Crow laws segregating schools, transportation, employment, and various public and private facilities. The reestablishment of white supremacy after the redemption of the South from Reconstruction contradicted proclamations of a new South. And perhaps nothing harkened so forcefully back to the barbaric Southern past than the wave of lynchings, the extra-legal murder of individuals by vigilantes that washed across the South after Reconstruction. Now, I warn you that some of these images, some of the things that we talk about here, is very disturbing. Lynching was a barbaric thing. And as you see from this image on the slide, this is one of the, I don't want to say more tame images, but perhaps one of the, and I don't even want to say easier ones to look at because nothing pertaining to lynching is easier to look at. But it gives you an idea of how lynching was done. I think many of us have this kind of image in our minds of it was done under the cover of darkness. People were dragged out of bed. They were taken out. They were set ablaze as they were hoisted up in trees. And it was usually just a few people around, a few people that had hoisted them out of the, had taken them out of bed. It was a public spectacle. And that's what's hard for us to rationalize is lynching was like this, oh boy, let's go see them lynch a person. It was barbaric. They sold postcards. There are postcard collections of lynchings. That's how commonplace it was. For actual crimes or fabricated crimes that white mobs murdered roughly 5,000 African Americans between the 1880s and the 1950s. Lynchings were not just murder. It was a ritual rich with symbolism. Victims were not simply hanged. They were mutilated, burned alive, and shot. Lynchings could become carnivals, public spectacles attended by thousands of eager spectators. Rail lines ran special cars to accommodate the rush of participants. Vendors sold goods and keepsakes. Perpetrators posed for photos and collected mementos as well. And it was increasingly common. One notorious example occurred in Georgia in 1899. Accused of killing his white employer and raping the man's wife, Sam Hose was captured by a mob and taken to the town of Newnan. Word of the impending lynching quickly spread, and specially chartered passenger trains brought some 4,000 visitors from Atlanta to witness the gruesome affair. Members of the mob tortured Hose for about an hour. They sliced off pieces of his body as he screamed in agony. Then they poured a can of kerosene over his body and burned him alive. At the barbaric height of Southern lynchings in the last years of the 19th century, Southerners lynched 2 to 3 African Americans every week. In general, lynchings were most frequent in the cotton belt of the lower South, where Southern black people were most numerous and where the majority worked as tenant farmers and field hands on the cotton farms of white landowners. The state of Mississippi and Georgia had the greatest, number of recorded lynchings. From 1880 to 1930, Mississippi lynch mobs, killed over 500 African Americans. Georgia mobs murdered more than 400. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a number of prominent Southerns openly supported lynching, arguing that it was necessary evil to punish Black rapists and deter others. Now, think about this. It was necessary? How was it necessary lynching young people, lynching young adults, lynching young women, even older people? How is this right? In the late 1890s, Georgia newspaper columnist and noted women's rights activist Rebecca Latimer Felton, who would later become the first woman to serve in the U.S. Senate, endorsed such extrajudicial killings. She said, "If it takes the lynching of to protest women's dearest or protect women's dearest possession from drunken, ravening beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 a week." Think about that. Somebody who goes on to serve in the Senate actually says this. Actually, point blank says this, that to protect a woman from rape, if it takes lynching 1,000, then let's do it. So one opponent argued that lynching violated victims' constitutional rights. South Carolina Governor Coleman Blease angrily responded, "Whenever the Constitution comes between me and the virtue of the white women of South Carolina, I say to hell with the Constitution." So deep feelings, powerful feelings, not always the feelings that are, shall we say, politically right. Harsh feelings. So, Black activists and white allies worked to outlaw lynching. Ida B. Wells, an African American woman born in the last years of slavery and a pioneering anti lynching advocate, lost three friends to a lynch mob in Memphis, Tennessee in 1892. That year, Wells published Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, a groundbreaking work that documented the South lynching culture and exposed the myth of the Black rapist. The Tuskegee Institute and the NAACP both compiled and publicized lists of every reported lynching in the United States. In 1918, Representative Leonidas Dyer of Missouri introduced federal and anti-lynching legislation, or federal, anti-lynching legislation that would have made local counties where lynchings took place legally liable for such killings. Throughout the early 1920s, the Dyer bill was the subject of heated political debate, but fiercely opposed by Southern congressmen and unable to win enough Northern champions, the proposed bill was never enacted. Lynching was not the only form of racial violence, as we will see, that survived Reconstruction. While political violence continued to follow African Americans, political participation in labor organization, however, severely circumscribed. When the popular insurgency created new opportunities for Black political activism, white Democrats responded with terror. In North Carolina, populists and Republicans fused together and won the stunning electoral gains in 1896. Shocked white Democrats formed red shirt groups, primarily organizations dedicated to eradicating Black political participation and restoring democratic rule through violence and intimidation, launching a self-described white supremacy campaign of violence and intimidation against Black voters and office holders. During the 1898 state election, the red shirts effectively took back state government. But municipal elections were not held that year in Wilmington, where fusionists controlled city government. After manning armed barricades blocking Black voters from entering the town to vote in state elections, the red shirts drafted a white Declaration of Independence, which declared that we will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin. Now, this is where more violence is going to unfold. 457 white Democrats signed the document. They also issued a 12-hour ultimatum that editor of the city's black daily newspaper flee the city. The editor left, but it wasn't enough. 12 hours later, hundreds of red shirts raided the city's armory and ransacked the newspaper office anyway. The mob swelled and turned on the city's black neighborhood, destroying homes and businesses and opening fire on any black person they found. Dozens were killed and hundreds more fled the city. The mob then forced the mayor, the city's alderman, and the police chief at gunpoint to immediately resign. To ensure their gains, the Democrats rounded up prominent fusionists, placed them on railroad cars, and under armed guard sent them out of state. So ultimately, they're making sure that any potential threat is removed from causing any more threats, quote unquote, to their governing. Lynching and organized terror campaigns were only the violent worst of the South's racial world. Discrimination in employment and housing and the legal segregation of public and private life also reflected the rise of a new Jim Crow South. Souths called Jim Crow laws legalized what customs had long dictated. Southern states had and municipalities enforce racial segregation in public places and in private lives. Separate coach laws were not some of the first such laws to appear, beginning in Tennessee in the 1880s. Soon, schools, stores, theaters, restaurants, bathrooms, and nearly every other part of public life was segregated. So too were social lives. The sin of racial mixing, critics said, had to be heavily guarded against. Marriage laws regulated against interracial couples and white men ever anxious to be in relationships with black men and white women passed miscegenation laws and justified lynching as an appropriate extra-legal tool to police the racial divide. In politics, de facto limitations of black voting had suppressed black voters since Reconstruction. White stuffed ballot boxes and intimidated black voters with physical and economic threats. And then from roughly 1890 to 1908, Southern states implemented de jure or legal and disenfranchisement. They passed laws requiring voters to pass literacy tests, which could be judged arbitrarily and pay poll taxes. What I might do is I might actually put up a literacy test so you can get an idea what a literacy test is as one of your activities, and then have you write some commentary on what you think of the literacy test as one of your activities this week. Which hit poor whites and poor black Americans alike, effectively denying black men the franchise that would suppose to that they were was supposed to have been guaranteed by the 15th Amendment. Those responsible for such laws posed as reformers and justified voting restrictions as for the public good, a way to clean up politics by purging corrupt African Americans from the voting rolls. With white supremacy secured, prominent white Southerners looked outward for support. New South boosters hoped to confront post Reconstruction uncertainties by rebuilding the South's economy and convincing the nation that the South could be more than an economically backward, race-obsessed backwater. And as they did, they began to retell the history of the recent past. A kind of civil religion known as the Lost Cause glorified the Confederacy and romanticized ultimately the Old South. White Southerners looked forward while simultaneously harking back to a mythic imagined past, inhabited by contented and loyal slaves, benevolent and generous masters, chivalric and honorable men, and pure and faithful Southern belles. Secession, they said, had little to do with the institution of slavery, and soldiers fought only for home and honor, not the continued ownership of human beings. The New South then would be built physically with new technologies, new investments, and new industries, but undergirded by political and social custom. So Henry Grady might have been declared the Confederate South dead, but its memory pervaded the thoughts and actions of white Southerners. Lost cause champions overtook the South. Women's groups, such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, joined with Confederate veterans to preserve a pro Confederate past. They built Confederate monuments and celebrated Confederate veterans on Memorial Day. Across the South, towns erected statues of General Robert E. Lee and other Confederate figures. By the turn of the 20th century, the idolized lost cause past was an entrenched not only in the South but across the country. In 1905, for instance, North Carolinian Thomas Dixon published a novel, The Klansman, which depicted the Ku Klux Klan as heroic defenders of the South against the corruption of African American and Northern carpetbag um, misrule during Reconstruction. In 1915, acclaimed film director David W. Griffith adapted Dixon's novel into the groundbreaking blockbuster film Birth of a Nation. The film almost single handedly rejuvenated the Ku Klux Klan. The romanticized version of the antebellum South and the distorted version of Reconstruction dominated popular imagination. So while Lost Cause defenders mythologized the past, New South boosters struggled to wrench the South into the modern world. The railroads became their focus. The region had lagged behind the North in the railroad building boom of the mid 19th century, and post war expansion facilitated connections between the most rural segments of the population and the region's rising urban areas. Boosters campaigned for the construction of new hard surface roads as well, arguing that improved roads would further increase the flow of goods and people and entice northern businesses to relocate the region. So, along with new transportation networks, New South boosters continued to promote industrial growth. The region witnessed the rise of various manufacturing industries, predominantly textiles, tobacco, furniture, and steel. While agriculture, cotton in particular, remained the mainstay of the region's economy, these new industries provided new wealth for owners, new investments for the region, and new opportunities for the exploding numbers of landless farmers to finally flee the land. Industries offered low-paying jobs, but also opportunity for rural poor who could no longer sustain themselves through subsistence farming. Men, women, and children all moved into wage work. At the turn of the 20th century, nearly one-fourth of Southern mill workers were children aged 6 to 16. In most cases, as in most aspects of life in the New South, new factory jobs were racially segregated. Better paying jobs were reserved for whites, while the most dangerous, labor intensive, dirtiest, and lowest paying positions were relegated to African Americans. African American women, shut out of most industries, found employment most often as domestic help for white families. As poor as white Southern mill workers were, Southern black people were poor. Some white mill workers could even afford to pay for domestic help and caring for young children, cleaning houses, doing laundry, and cooking meals. Mill villages that grew up alongside factories were whites only, and African American families were pushed to the outer perimeter of the settlements. That a New South emerged in the decades between Reconstruction and World War I is debatable. If measured by industrial output and railroad construction, the New South was a reality, but it measured relative to the rest of the nation, it was a limited one. If measured in terms of racial discrimination, however, the New South looked much like the old. Boosters such as Henry Grady said the South was done with racial questions, but lynching and segregation and the institutionalization of Jim Crow exposed the South's lingering racial obsessions. Industrial development and expanding infrastructure, rather than recreating the South, coexisted easily with white supremacy and impoverished agriculture economy. The trains came, factories were built, and capital was invested, but the region remained mired in poverty and racial apartheid. Much of the New South then was anything but new. So it brings us to, and I forgot to turn to this slide, so you could see an example of lost cause, which is slide 9. We'll move to slide 10 now, which is gender, religion, and culture. So we go very quickly into, we open up this section briefly with the controversy over John D. Rockefeller offering a donation of $100,000 to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions in 1905. Now, the reason that there was such a controversy was it looked tainted. I'm sorry, I keep disappearing off my video today. I just realized I was off my video. Let's see what's going on here. There we go. All right, so hold my Kindle down here. So anyway, as I was saying, the controversy was whether this organization would accept this money from Rockefeller, because some people saw it as being tainted, that he'd made it on the backs of his workers. And as it comes down to it, the tainted money debate reflected questions about proper relationship between religion and capitalism. With rising income inequalities, would religious groups be forced to support either the elite or the disempowered? What was the moral in the new industrial United States? And what obligations did wealth bring? Steel magnate Andrew Carnegie popularized the idea of a gospel of wealth in an 1889 article claiming that the true antidote for the temporary unequal distribution of wealth was the moral obligation of the rich to give to charity. Farmers and labor organizers, meanwhile, argued that God had blessed the weak, and the new Gilded Age fortunes and corporate managements were inherently immoral. So, as time passed, American churches increasingly adapted themselves to the new industrial order. Even Gladden, even Gladden himself, referring to one of the people that was questioning the donation, came to accept donations from the so-called robber barons, such as the Baptist John D. Rockefeller, who increasingly touted the morality of business. So secular knowledge seeking and Gilded Age dollars increasingly muscled out of the traditional role of religion in American higher education as well. The Gilded Age elite funneled their fortunes into new elite private institutions. The Morrill land grants of 1862 and 1890 subsidized new schools that emphasized practical knowledge in science, engineering, and agriculture. The 1890 Act also provided for Black colleges in states with segregated universities. 9 years after Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a model of Black vocational education that Washington championed across the South and much of the country. Daniel Coit Gilman, meanwhile, borrowed the models of research-based graduate education from German universities, a popular destination for elite Americans who studied abroad, when he presided over the newly established Johns Hopkins University in 1876. At Harvard, educational reformer Charles William Eliot advocated for and modeled for the nation the replacement of a strictly guided classical curriculum with a more open ended and practical minded elective system. At the same time, women occupied a larger and larger percentage of American college students, either as students at separate women's colleges or and increasingly at coeducational institutions. So women are beginning to break free of this tradition that a woman needs to immediately go from being a child to a young woman to married and bearing children. All of a sudden, young women are going, wait a second, I can go on with my education. I can become more educated. I can actually become um, oh, a person of letters, what is a scholar. So, this is what's starting to happen. Such trends in many ways mirrored the emerging social and cultural forces in America, and women's greatest presence in American life, as typified by higher education, became sites for public discussion over the fate of traditional American masculinity. The economic and social changes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including increasing urbanization, immigration, advancements in science and technology, patterns of consumption, and the new availability of goods and new awareness of economic, racial, and gender equalities, challenged traditional gender norms. At the same time, urban spaces and shifting culture and social values presented new opportunities to challenge the traditional gender and sexual norms. Many women carrying on a campaign that stretched long into the past vied for equal rights. They became activists. They targeted municipal reforms and launched labor rights campaigns and, above all, bolstered the suffrage movement. Urbanization and immigration fueled anxieties that old social mores were being subverted and that old forms of moral policing were increasingly inadequate. The anonymity of urban spaces presented an opportunity, in particular, for female sexuality and for male and female sexual experimentation along a spectrum of orientations and gender identities. So we're starting to see a relaxing of the very stringent, you have to be married, you have to be in committed relationships. You even have to be with a man and woman. We're starting to see this gradual relaxing in this time period. This is going to lead into the 1920s, where we really start to see the relaxing of morals. So women's this generational thing starts to change significantly. Anxiety over female sexuality reflected generational tensions and differences, as well as racial and class ones. As young women pushed back against social mores through premarital sexual exploration and expression, social welfare experts and moral reformers labeled such girls feeble minded, believing even that such unfeminine behavior could be symptomatic of clinical insanity rather than free willed expression. Generational differences exacerbated the social and familial tensions provoked by shifting gender norms. Women's fashions loosed its physical constraints as well. Corsets relaxed and hemlines rose. The newfound physical freedom enabled by looser dress was also mimicked in the pursuit of other freedoms. While many women worked to liberate themselves, many sometimes simultaneously worked to uplift others. Women's work against alcohol propelled temperance into one of the most foremost moral reforms of the period. Middle class, typically Protestant women based their assault on alcohol on the basis of their feminine virtue, Christian sentiment, and their protective role in the family and home. Others, like Jane Addams and settlement house workers, sought to impart a middle class education on immigrant and working class women through the establishment of settlement homes. Other reformers touted a scientific motherhood. The new science of hygiene was deployed as a method of both social uplift and moralizing, particularly of working class and immigrant women. Women vocalized new discontents through literature. We have Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which attacked the naturalness of feminine domesticity and critiqued Victorian psychological remedies administered to women, such as the rest cure. We also have Kate Chopin's The Awakening, which set in the American South, likewise criticized the domestic and familial roles ascribed to women by society and gave expression to feelings of malaise, desperation, and desire. On slide 11, we have female activism, which meant women that worried too about their own masculine, or men worried about their own masculinity because of this female activism. To anxious observers, industrial capitalism was withering American manhood. Rather than working on farms and in factories where young men formed physical muscle, and spiritual grit, new generation of workers labored behind desks, wore white collars. In the words of Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, appeared black-coated, stiff-jointed, soft-muscled, and paste-complexioned. Neurologist George Beard even coined a medical term, neurasthenia, for a new emasculated condition that was marked by depression, indigestion, hypochondria, and extreme nervousness. The philosopher William James called it Americanitis. Academics increasingly warned the America had become a nation of emasculated men. So, church is too worried about the feminization. Women had always comprised a clear majority of church memberships in the United States, but now the theologian Washington Gladden, a preponderance of female influence in the church or anywhere else in society is unnatural and injurious. So, that fear of the feminized church had feminized Christ himself. Rather than a rough hewn carpenter, Jesus had been made mushy and sweetly effeminate. In the words of Walter Rushbosh, advocates of the so called muscular Christianity sought to stiffen young men's backbones by putting them back in touch with their primal manliness. Pulling from contemporary developmental theory, they believed that young men ought to evolve as civilization evolved, advancing from primitive nature dwelling to modern industrial enlightenment. To facilitate primitive encounters with nature, muscular Christians founded summer camps and outdoor boys' clubs with the Woodcraft Indians, the Sons of Daniel Boone, and the Boys' Brigades, all precursors to the Boy Scouts. Other champions of muscular Christianity, such as the newly formed Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, built gymnasiums often attached to churches where youths could strengthen their bodies as well as their spirits. It was a Young Man's Christian Association, the YMCA leader, who coined the term bodybuilding, and others that invented the sports of basketball and volleyball. Muscular Christianity, though, was about even more than building strong bodies and minds. Many advocates also ardently championed Western imperialism, cheering on attempts to civilize non Western people. Gilded Age men were encouraged to embrace a particular vision of masculinity connected intimately with the rising tides of nationalism, militarism, and imperialism. Contemporary ideals of American masculinity at the turn of the century developed in concert with the United States imperial and militaristic endeavors in the West and abroad. During the Spanish American War in 1898, Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders embodied the idealist image of the tall, strong, virile, and fit American man that simultaneously epitomized the ideals of power that informed the United States imperial agenda. So, we then come to new forms of mass culture. Vaudeville signaled new cultural worlds. A unique variety of popular entertainments, these traveling circuit shows first appeared during the Civil War and peaked between 1890 and 1920. Vaudeville shows featured comedians, musicians, actors, jugglers, and other talents that could captivate an audience. Unlike earlier rowdy acts meant for male audience that included alcohol, vaudeville was considered family-friendly, polite entertainment, though the acts involved offensive ethnic and racial caricatures of African Americans and recent immigrants. Popular entertainers such as silent film star Charlie Chaplin and magician Harry Houdini made names for themselves on the vaudeville circuit. By the turn of the 20th century, two technologies pioneered by Edison, the phonograph and motion pictures, stood ready to revolutionize leisure and help create the mass entertainment culture of the 20th century. The phonograph was the first reliable device capable of recording and reproducing sound, but it was more than that. The phonograph could create multiple copies of recordings, sparking a great expansion of the market for popular music. Although the phonograph was a technical success, Edison at first had trouble developing commercial applications for it. He thought it might be used for dictation, recording audio letters, preserving speeches and dying words of great men, producing talking clocks, or teaching elocution. Obviously something I need. He did not anticipate that its greatest use would be in the field of mass entertainment, but Edison's sales agents soon reported that many phonographs were being used for just that, especially in so-called phonograph parlors, where customers could pay a nickel to hear a piece of music. By the turn of the century, Americans were purchasing phonographs for home use. Entertainment became the phonograph's major market. Inspired by the success of the phonograph as an entertainment device, Edison decided in 1888 to develop an instrument which does for the eye, which the phonograph does for the ear. In 1888, he patented the concept of motion pictures. In 1889, he innovated the rolling of film. And by 1891, he was exhibiting a motion picture camera, a kinetograph, and a viewer, a kinetoscope. By 1894, the Edison Company had produced about 75 films suitable for sale or viewing. And by 1896, the Edison Vitascope could project film, shifting audiences away from arcades and pulling them into theaters. Long-form fictional films created a demand for movie stars such as glamorous Mary Pickford, the swashbuckling Douglas Fairbanks, and the acrobatic comedian Buster Keaton, who began to appear in the popular imagination beginning around 1910. So ultimately, this is the end of the chapter. So we come to the interactive activity on slide 12 is the introduction. And this is your interactive activity, and it should be 3. I don't know why I put this 4. In the opening of this lecture, we talked about the significance of railroads during the era. What were some of the factors that made railroads significant into this time period? Provide details. Provide details. So let's see, would that be interactive activity 4? Let's see, 15, 16, 17, 18. Yeah, this would be interactive activity number 4. I was wrong with the interactive number 3. It's number 4. You're right. This is right. So number 4. So anyway, with that, we come to the close of this chapter. I will see you in the next one. So let me stop the share here. There we go. And I will say goodbye to you for now and see you in the next video.